Recording in progress.
Well, hello and welcome to our study of How Great is Our God. We're looking at a subtitle of Passing the Faith Along, and of course, a study of big events of the Old Testament. What we've been doing is looking at different individuals in their encounter with God and what God has called them to do, and how that impacted the plan of redemption throughout the history of Israel, and what God was working to do in each of those individuals' lives. Last lesson, we saw the people of Israel encamped and ready to go into the promised land. And the first person to demonstrate faith that we looked at was Rahab. And what we're going to do today is look at Joshua specifically as he gets ready to take Jericho with the people of Israel. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and open them up to Joshua chapter 5. We're going to be looking at the last part of that chapter, verses 13 to 15. And then we'll look at chapter 6, verses 1 through 5 to continue. So if you have your Bible open, you'll look there. The title of the lesson is Holy Ground. And you'll see some parallels there between Joshua specifically and Moses in a previous generation. As we said in the previous lesson, the study that we've been following skipped a long period of time, and now we've compressed the time a little bit to spend more time on this very significant time period in the people of Israel, and that is to look at the taking of the promised land. Rahab, the prostitute, a woman of Jericho, was one who demonstrated faith on behalf of Israel, and now has given promise to help the spies, so that she would be helped along with her family. If, of course, when the people of Israel came to take Jericho, she had that scarlet cord hanging out the window, and all of her family was there. We fast forward now a little bit to Joshua as he's getting ready to take the land, and I want to pick up the story there as we get ready to go. But before we get into the narrative, I do want to go over, as always, an outline of the text so that we can see the progression of the text and work into how we can talk about it verse by verse. Again, the title is Holy Ground. And what I'm going to do is use a lot of alliteration here, and also use the repetition of lettering. First thing we're going to see in verses 13 to 14 as we read is the petition regarding victory. Again, won't give everything away, but just wanted to tell you that Joshua is going to have a visitor, and there will be a conversation about that person's allegiance. Verse 15, very briefly, the preparation for victory. In other words, this visitor is going to tell Joshua something he needs to do in order to prepare himself for what is about to happen. Then we turn to chapter 6, and again, this is a continuing narrative. Verses 1 to 2, the promise of victory. The word is going to come out that there's already a victory in place. They just have to carry it out. And to carry it out, they have to follow the path to victory. What the person who is before them will do, and it turns out to be the Lord, will tell them what they need to do in order to experience the victory that has already promised them. We'll see that in verses 3 through 5. Well, if you have your Bibles, go ahead and open them up, and I want to walk with you through the text to help you walk through the text and be able to see how God is working in the life of Israel, and then to seek some application for ourselves. So first, we're going to read the text, and then we'll walk through a description of its introduction and verse by verse discussion of the contents. So Joshua chapter 5, verses 13 to 15. I'm reading from the New American Standard Bible, the 2020 edition. And we pick up the story really in the middle of preparation for going into Jericho. Verse 13, now it came about when Joshua was by Jericho, he raised his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, are you for us or for our enemies? He said, no, rather I have come now as captain of the army of the Lord. And Joshua fell on his face to the ground and bowed down and said to him, what has my Lord to say to his servant? And the captain of the Lord's army said to Joshua, remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy. And Joshua did so. Now Jericho was tightly shut because of the sons of Israel. No one went out and no one came in. The Lord said to Joshua, see, I have handed Jericho over to you, with its kings and the valiant warriors. And you shall march around the city, all the men of war, circling the city once. You shall do so for 6 days. Also, 7 priests shall carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. Then on the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. It shall be that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people shall go up, everyone straight ahead. Well, let's go ahead and take a look at this text. We give some background, of course, because there is a focal passage that we just read, but there is some background material that you can see that is important to look at, and won't be able to read all of it, of course, but what we can do is go through the process of giving some discussion. So background passage, if you have time to go back and read it, we'll draw from some information there to give you some preparation for this text. But the background passage for our study is Joshua chapter 4, verses 1 to 3, then verse 8, then verses 20 to 24. And then you have another text in 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 15 through 17. And have you go back and read some of that on your own. What this allows us to do, though, is take time to summarize some of that, and then we'll prepare, as background for what we're going to be looking at. So let me jump into that. And as we do, we'll walk through preparing for what Joshua encounters, and then we'll discuss a little bit what's going on with the encounter with this captain of the Lord's army, and then what that person, who turns out to be the Lord, has to say about Joshua. Well, let me go through the text. The time had come for the people of Israel to enter the land of Canaan and begin the promise of taking it for themselves, as God had promised. Let me back up. The time had come for the people of Israel to enter the land of Canaan and begin the process of taking it for themselves, as God had promised their ancestors centuries ago. In Joshua chapter 4, instructions were given and followed, which led to the crossing of the Jordan River into the land. The people crossed on dry ground and set up memorial stones to remind future generations of what God had done for Israel in bringing them into the land by crossing the Jordan on dry ground. The next step, of course, was to take the city of Jericho. You may be hearing some parallels, just as the people had entered or left Egypt going into the wilderness. In the book of Exodus, they passed through the Red Sea on dry ground. Now they have passed through the Jordan going into the promised land on dry ground. Well, then, just as Rahab had previously voiced to the spies the collective fears of the inhabitants of the city of Jericho because of what they had heard about God and his vision for the Israelites, so chapter 5 opens with a summary statement about the fears of the Amorites and the Canaanites collectively. They too had heard what God was doing for Israel, and they feared. The scene was set then. Before complete entrance into the land could occur, proper spiritual preparation had to be made first. And that's what we read in this passage. The generation of males born in the wilderness had not been circumcised to show their identification as the covenant of people of God, and that was completed. So on the behalf of the people, they had to be circumcised, make themselves part of the covenant, align themselves with Yahweh, with the Lord more directly and personally. Then they could serve him. Then the timing of the entrance required they celebrate the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. You'll read all about that in chapter 4 and 5. Another sign that they were entering into the next stage in their progress came when they ate manna for the last time. Then the manna ceased from that moment on. So you see this transition taking place. They would no longer need the manna. That was the past. It represented God's provision for them in the wilderness. Instead, for the first time, they enjoyed the produce from the land they just entered and were about to conquer. This marked the promise of future provision from God. To enjoy their future provision, however, one more thing needed to be done, and that the taking of the first step toward the conquering of the land, and that was to take the city of Jericho first. Now, there was all this preparation. What needed to be done now is the actual carrying out of the actual fight, if you will, to take the land. Well, we've read Joshua chapter 5, verses 13 to 15, and then 6, 1 to 5. What we want to do is go through it verse by verse and take a look at how God worked in this to prepare Joshua for what would take place. Notice in this text, we haven't had the actual battle. We're just dealing with that which leads up to the battle. So one of the things we see in verses 13 to 14, again, our point one is the prospects of victory. Now, we could say prospects of victory. We could talk about the prohibitions or the preventative of victory, because we read the text and we're told about this visitor to Joshua. We don't really know what's going on. We don't know who this is. Verse 13, then, as we've already read, can be explained in this way. With everything set, or so it seemed, the approach to Jericho was the next step. It was the first challenge that the Israelites faced. As we can see, if you look back at Joshua 5:10, it states that the Israelites were at Gilgal in the desert, in the plains of Jericho. There was only a short distance then between Gilgal and Jericho, so the approach would not take long. Moving deliberately and with focus, Joshua led the people on the short southwest trek from Gilgal toward Jericho. So they're moving in that direction. As he walked, Joshua raised his eyes and looked up, and he was met by what was described as a man facing him with a sword drawn. Now, the NASB says he was opposite him. So Joshua's walking along and he looks up. Who knows why he's looking down, but he looks up and maybe above him, or at least directly in front of him. And he sees this figure and his sword is drawn. Rather than stopping where he was, Joshua kept moving forward and approached the man. Interesting. He had one question for this person. Are you for us, or are you for our enemies? Getting ready to go into battle, of course, against Jericho, Joshua needed to know the nature of this encounter. Was this person volunteering to join forces with Israelites against the people of Jericho? And this could entirely be a reasonable explanation. It could be really a possibility. As stated in our introduction, we note that before the beginning of chapter 5, there were reports about the people from the many surrounding cities of the Amorites on the west of the Jordan, and the Canaanites living by the sea, even further west by the Mediterranean, that had heard about what the Lord had been doing and doing on behalf of Israel from the time they crossed the Red Sea decades prior. So there has word out. This is the same as what Rahab was telling Joshua or the spies in the previous lesson. Their response was the same as we said as with Rahab and the spies. As we will see, their hearts were melting. Their hearts melted, and there was no spirit in them any longer because of the sons of Israel. In other words, we see in chapter 5, verse 1, that the people are already fearful. It's not unlikely then that someone, knowing what God is doing on behalf of Israel, would say, we're not going to stay on this side, we're going to go on that side. So knowing that fighting against the Israelites would be a lost cause, it would not be out of the question that someone, a resident in the land, might consider defecting and joining the Israelites. But of course, there's another possibility that lay before Joshua as well. This could very well be someone who chose to align himself with the enemies of Israel. And in order to decide his course of action, figuring out what kind of person this was, Joshua needed to know who he was facing. What was the intent of the individual before him? Well, what we see in this prospect of victory is the possibility also of a victor, or the possibility of a prohibition or an encounter that would prevent victory. Here's a person sword drawn already, and he's wanting to know, Joshua is wanting to know who this is. Well, in verse 14, we see the initial response of the man to Joshua's question might seem odd. Joshua posed to him an either or question. Are you for Israel, or are you for our enemies? The man simply said, no. And I was like, wait a minute, either yes or no. For us or against us? He says no. Now, the rest of the answer explains the initial response. This man was not on the side of the Israelites. He was not on the side of the Israelites' enemies. He was before Joshua as the captain of the army of the Lord. Keep in mind, angel of the Lord. In previous discussions, in previous encounters that people had, here we have the captain of the army. Fitting title, given the fact that Joshua is about to go into battle. Recognizing then, this is Joshua, recognizing the nature of the person before him, Joshua placed himself in a fully prostrated position. on the ground, even with his face to the ground. With that, he still brought himself to bow before the man. So not only is he on the ground with his face to the ground, he's bowing. This is not just something that seems to be simultaneous, but consecutive. He did that, then he bowed on top of that. He was originally looking up. Remember, we noted that. But now he's face down. His language matched the position of his submission as well. While speaking, Joshua could not bring himself to use the language of direct address. In other words, he wasn't talking directly to the person, it seems. Instead, he spoke in the third person. Joshua referred to the man in full respect, calling him my Lord, and referred to himself as his servant. In other words, the servant of this one he's encountering, further illustrating Joshua's recognition that he was the subordinate one in this encounter. Still, he was able to bring himself to ask the question. Now, in the full posture of submission to the man, Joshua wanted to know what the man's message was for him. Notice what he says. Let's go back and read the text a little bit so you can gain a sense of what Joshua is going through. I think it's insightful to see how the text reads. Came about when Joshua was by Jericho, he raised his eyes and looked up, and behold, a man was standing opposite him with a sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, are you for us or for our enemies? A very poignant question. He said, the captain of the Lord's army says, no, rather I have come now as captain of the army of the Lord. Joshua fell on his face to the ground and bowed down and said to him, what has my Lord to say to his servant? Notice how Joshua refers to himself in the third person, his servant, not me. He doesn't say, what has my Lord to say to me? But he refers to himself as the servant. He recognizes then that who he is the subordinate one in the sentence or in the encounter. We'll read verse 15 in a moment, but I want to talk about explaining it a little bit. He's on the ground, Joshua is. He's asked, what do you have to tell me? And what is told is not even anything specific yet, except one specific direction, and that is how then to respond to this encounter. The captain of the Lord's army had one message for Joshua, and it was this command. The captain commanded Joshua to remove his sandals. The place where he was standing was holy. Moses had previously received the same command when the angel of the Lord, who there turned out to be the Lord himself, encountered the angel of the Lord at the burning bush. In other words, when the angel of the Lord encountered Moses at the burning bush, the instructions were that Moses would take off his sandals because the place where he was standing was holy. You can go back and read that in Exodus chapter 3, verses 2 to 5. This is one of a number of parallels between Moses and his leadership of the people of Israel and Joshua and his leadership of the people of Israel. As that's one, the holy ground. There are others. We've just discussed one of those. We'll note it here. As Moses led the people through the Red Sea on dry ground, so Joshua led Israel through the Jordan on dry ground. Now, there was no burning bush for Joshua, but there was an appearance representing God, revealing the place that Joshua stood as holy. The appropriate response then was to remove his sandals. So there are other responses. One parallel we'll see is already alluded to here in verse 14, where Joshua calls himself his servant, meaning the servant of the captain of the Lord's army. He doesn't yet know that this is actually God, but what we see is Moses is referred to as the servant of God. He's the servant of the Lord, the servant of Yahweh. Here, Joshua is at first in other places referred to as the servant of Moses, but he's referring to himself now as the servant of the captain of the Lord's army. Again, the captain of the Lord, we'll talk, or the servant of the Lord, we'll talk about that as we'll see in the text. But later, we actually have the book of Joshua concluding with a reference to Joshua himself as the servant of the Lord, just like Moses was the servant of the Lord. We could go back and note a number of other parallels between Moses and Joshua. A big one that jumps out us here, of course, is the fact that he is told to remove his sandals, where the place where he was standing was holy. Now, it's interesting. I know that we have chapter and verses here, and those aren't in the original, but it's important to note that at this point in verse 15, nothing else has been said about what command Israel, or excuse me, the captain of the Lord's army has for Joshua. I'll read it to you. The captain of the Lord's army said to Joshua, remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy. And Joshua did so. There's no word other than that until, of course, we keep moving. There's no other instruction. There is no other word of encouragement. There's no other promise of the Lord's presence moving forward yet. What we do see in verse 15 is that Joshua obeyed what the captain of the Lord's army had told him to do. He removed his sandals. The place where he was standing was holy. Now, as I said just a second ago, we know that the Bible didn't originally have those chapters and verses. And so, at least for effect, we can stop and pause before we move into chapter 6, verse 1. But what we would have in the meantime, is we were to keep reading the text, is what happens next. And so we read further and check what happens next. I want to read that to you. We're going to break up that text. So we've had the prospect of victory, now preparation for victory. So what we're seeing here is the need for him to prepare for victory. And that means starting off with the proper reverence, the proper understanding that the place where he was standing was holy. And what we get to see is further revelation of who is this person that is before Joshua. Chapter 6, verses 1 and 1 and following, 1 through 3 and 5, 1 and 2. Rather abruptly then, the scene changed from Joshua's encounter with the captain of the Lord to a description of what was happening at Jericho. So again, we're told at the end of chapter 5 what Joshua was to do. He's supposed to simply take his shoes off, the sandals off, because he was in a holy place. Then there is instruction by way of introduction or by way of illustration and description of what's going on, where Joshua is going. Remember, Joshua is already leading a group of people toward Jericho. What is about to be described to him is what he's expecting when he gets there. So again, rather abruptly, the scene changed from Joshua's encounter with the captain of the Lord to the description of what was happening in Jericho. Because the Israelites were near the city, because the Israelites were near the city, it was closed up tightly. So they were near the city, it was closed up tightly. And that's because, again, the people of Jericho and the surrounding cities had heard about what the Lord was doing on behalf of the Israelites, and they were fearful. And we'll see about that in a moment. But now they are starting to see this. And as a result, the city is closed up tightly. How closed up that was is further described by the lack of movement into and out of the city of Jericho. There was no movement in any direction. That's the point that the text is making. Let me go ahead and read that verse to you. Now Jericho was tightly shut up because of the sons of Israel. No one went out and no one came in. We're getting a sense of what's happening here in Jericho. And I think that's an important point to make, given, since we're not going to actually see the battle played out in this lesson, is that when Rahab pointed out the fear to the spies, fear of the people. Now Joshua, as we are reading the text, are getting a description of their response, such that there is no movement. They are fearful. They are concerned. They are obviously afraid of what's happening as they see what's happening with this group of people approaching. Verse 2, no longer was it the captain of the Lord who spoke with Joshua. The Lord himself spoke directly to him. First, and this is important to catch as we move through the text, and I'll read it to you after we've explained a thing or two here. First, God exhorted Joshua metaphorically to see. He was calling attention to the significance of what he was about to say to Joshua. He says, see now. Obviously, doesn't mean see with his eyes. The word the Lord spoke was the word of promise. So we have now the promise of victory. So we've seen prospect of victory, preparation for victory. Now we're seeing the promise of victory. He's giving a word in advance that there will be victory. The Lord spoke a word of promise to Joshua. Victory will be the outcome when Joshua and the Israelites combat Jericho and its king and warriors, valiant warriors they're called. The assurance of victory is so great that the Lord gave the promise in the past tense. Notice he says, he doesn't say that he will hand Jericho over to Joshua. He says rather, he has already handed Jericho over to him. Notice again the text in this subtle way, already giving this promise in the past. The Lord said to Joshua. Now, I think it's important to point out that, again, because of the chapter and numbers here, it may seem like the characters have switched out. At the end of chapter 5, we're seeing a person who is called the captain of the Lord's army, or the captain of the Lord. And now we're seeing a shift to the Lord speaking to Joshua. That is not to say that the captain of the Lord's army leaves and the Lord shows up. It's the fact that the identity of this captain, this person or this individual entity who reveals himself first as captain of the Lord, or the captain of the Lord's army, is the Lord himself. This is Yahweh himself in the presence of Joshua. Again, we saw that similar thing in the book of Exodus with Moses. The angel of the Lord appeared, it was the Lord. We've seen this, and we'll see this in other places throughout the parts of the Old Testament. You will see that as we read forward. We look at Samson's parents, for instance. They will encounter the angel of the Lord, but it'll turn out to be the Lord himself. I think because of the chapter and verse, we may think that the scene has changed completely. We're still in the same situation. Now what the narrator is doing is saying, this was the Lord all along. The Lord said to Joshua, see, again, not with his eyes of vision, but as a way of catching his attention. Note this, I have handed Jericho over to you with its king and the valiant warriors. It's already done. Now, that's the word of promise that is given. What we need to then look at is the plan, or the path to victory. It's an interesting path. We'll read it again as we've already done so, but let's go ahead and explain a little bit of what's happening here. We're given a specific direction on what to do. And as we read the plan and we read about the path, we're going to note this: nothing's done yet. They just need to follow instructions and do as they are told. And if they do so, then they will see God act on their behalf. Well, let's look then at the path to victory, verses 3 through 5, to conclude and come up with a discussion of some of the application and the direction of the text. You shall march around the city, all the men of war, circling the city once. You shall do so for 6 days. Also 7 priests shall carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. Then on the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. Then verse 5, and it shall be that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people shall go up, everyone straight ahead, or straight ahead. Interesting plan. Doesn't give them any military strategy, just tells them basically walk around the city. Following that, and reading verses 3 to 5, after the promise of victory is already given, I have handed the city of Jericho over to you. Following on those words of assurance, then come the instructions on what they are to do so that victory would come about. And it's a really unusual set of instructions. Joshua and the Israelites had received the assurance, but there was still work for them to do. God says, I've already given the city over to you, but they still have to do their part. It's not just going to be given to them and handed to them. To be sure, they were unusual circumstances or unusual instructions, as we said. The action toward the city would still involve the men of war. They have to be there. For a series of 6 consecutive days, then the men of war would march around the city once each day. Can you imagine what look would be on the face of the people of Jericho watching the Israelites show up as if to engage in battle, and then all they do is walk around the city, and then they leave? This is kind of a taunt, if you will. They're already afraid. They already know that God is on the side of the Israelites. Here they come. Imagine that. 6 days. The people show up, they walk around, and then they leave. Each day, perhaps the people of Jericho are thinking, this is the day that we're going to die. And then there's nothing that happens. That's 6 days. The other thing is that this is a spiritual battle as well. And as a result, not only are the men of war going to go around the city, God has instructed Joshua that the priests would accompany them. So in verse 4, it's not just the men of war that will be there. They're not alone. They will be accompanied by 7 priests. And these um, priests would march in front of the Ark of the Covenant, blowing their trumpets of ram's horns. So not only is there the walking around, but the priests are leading, blowing the trumpets of the ram's horns in front of the Ark of the Covenant. There's something to say about that in a second. While the Ark itself possessed no power on its own to assure victory, it did represent God's presence among them. And it's important to note that the ark represents that they are part of the people of God. They are the covenant people of God. And this represents his presence among them. The priests are then leading this ark in procession, or walking along with the ark procession, saying that the Lord goes before them. It's important, though, to recognize, and this is where we want to focus, it's important to recognize that the ark was not the power itself. It's what it represented. The people in Israel later would put so much faith in the object of the ark that misplaced allegiance, that misplaced trust, that misplaced focus would end up coming back to bite them or to backfire on them when that would be taken from them. So in a later generation, we'll see that even the book of Judges later. In later generations, the Israelites would actually presume that the presence of the ark would mean victory, that would guarantee victory. They see it, they will see it here. They think it's going to happen all the time. They misplaced their trust in the object instead of what the object represented. They were thinking about, as long as we have the ark, we'll be victorious. The reality is the ark represented the presence of God. And what they should have been saying is, because if God is with us, we will have victory. It's going to be a very important thing. We'll talk about Samson later. And what his misplaced trust would lead to. Well, we're told that they had the priest with the ark and they walked around. First day, 1 time. Second day, 1 time, all the way through 6 days. They were to march around the city of Jericho in the following arrangement. There was to be a group of men of war leading the procession, followed by the priest with the trumpets walking in front of the Ark of the Covenant. They, in turn, would be followed by another group of a rear guard of men of war. And what you want to do there is read the continuing passage here in chapter 6, read verses 6 through 9 that follow. We don't get into that text at this point. For 6 days, then they would circle Jericho once. On the 7th day, the instructions were totally different. That 7th day, then, all the parties involved were to march around the city 7 times. And all the while, then, notice, as they are walking around, as they are going to be walking around, they are to blow the trumpets of the horns all the time, those 7 days, or the 7 times constantly, not at the beginning of the march, but during the whole march around 7 times. Then they were to make a long blast of sound from the trumpets of ram's horns, and that would be the signal to all the people to join in with great shouts of their own. So again, you have the priest making the noise. Now the people that are there, the men of war, are also going to shout. Again, they are going to participate in the battle. The battle is given to them by the Lord. They still have to engage the battle. With that combination of trumpets blaring and the people shouting, we're going to see that the wall of the city would fall flat. Again, God is telling Joshua what's going to happen. In ensuing text, you see that it happens that way. At that moment, then, when the wall of the city around Jericho would collapse, then the people would go in and take the city. They were then to go up into the city. So you have these instructions. We have the path to victory. What's the recap here? God had guaranteed victory for Joshua before the battle. Then he instructed Joshua on what parts he and the people of Israel would play in bringing about that victory. All they had to do next was to carry out the plan as directed. Again, speaking in terms of what we're not going to read, we'll see that they do carry it out and there will be victory. But it's important to note here for our own personal application, God can promise victory. Victory means that there is a battle. There is some engagement that takes place. God has guaranteed that. Maybe there's something God has guaranteed in your life. Maybe we have to think about the spiritual life of a Christian, or the goal of a Christian and living out that Christian life. God has guaranteed victory over a certain situation. That doesn't mean you don't engage it. Here, God has already given victory to the people of Israel in the city of Jericho, but they still had to battle. They still had to do their part. What God has done is given them guarantee of the victory. And of course, he is going to be the one that ultimately gets credit for it, because what happens next as we read the story going forward is that they will carry out the plan and the city walls will collapse and the people will go in. There's still the engagement there. But here's the part that God did. He caused the collapse of the walls. Now they have to do their part. God is bringing about victory, but he makes it possible for us to see the part that we play. We still have to carry out the battle. We still have to engage in the battle. So moving forward into our conclusion, the rest of Joshua 6 presents in detail what happened next. Joshua relayed these instructions to the people, and in faith they carried them out. And we do see that Jericho was defeated as God had promised. The taking of Jericho then is a big event. It's a major event. It's a major event and a big event of God. It was as big an event as there ever would be in Israel's history. How so? First, it was not an event involving just one person like some of the big events previously that we've studied and we will study in the future. Yes, Joshua was an individual, but his position of leadership over the people of Israel meant that his decision in leadership and his decisions in leadership would have immediate impact on the people. As Joshua would go, so would go all the Israelites. That's one aspect that makes this a big event. Second, the taking of Jericho was a defining moment in the history of Israel. They had entered the land, but the land must be taken. It would not be given to them by the inhabitants. They weren't going to just lay down. They were afraid, of course. We're told that they were afraid. They knew what God was doing on behalf of the Israelites, but they aren't just going to give up the land. There would be battles. No matter how much it was reported that they feared the God of Israel, they were still going to battle against the Israelites. Taking the whole land then must begin with the taking of one city. And I think that's a key spiritual application for us. We may have victory guaranteed. We still have to wage battle. And that battle includes a first battle. That first battle then must be played out. Furthermore, the people of Israel had the opportunity to undo what was done a generation before. Remember the reason they had to wander in the wilderness. The reason they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years was because they did not believe God would give them victory or could give them victory over the inhabitants of the land. Go back in time again to the book of Numbers. Moses sends out 12 spies. 10 of them come back with a bad report. 2 of them come back with a good report. Now, they all 12 come back with positive report in one sense, and that is a beautiful land flowing with milk and honey. It will produce the things that we need to survive. They also agreed that the land is full of giants, people that are there, and they are fierce, and it would take a battle to win it. Here's where they differed. 10 of them said, we can't do this. God can't even give us victory over this group of people. And it was only later that Joshua and Caleb, the 2 spies that went into the land, say, no, we do know that it's a good land flowing with milk and honey. We do know that there is a challenge before us, but God can do it. Unfortunately, the cry of the 10 outweighed the prospect and the promise offered up by the 2, Joshua and Caleb, such that the people did not believe that God could take them into the land. And therefore God said, well, you're going to wander in the land. What test lay before the Israelites at this generation was, are they going to believe God will give them the land? This new generation, by exercising faith in God's word of promise, would, or I should say could, and would experience that victory. They were given another chance to believe. If they would believe God's promise and remain faithful to the covenant, they would see what their predecessors were prohibited from seeing. They, in fact, did have that first victory. We're not going to read the text. You read the text and you see that there is that victory. Unlike the previous generation, I should say, this group put their faith in God instead of looking at the challenge of their circumstances. Now, this is not to decry Moses in any way, but it's interesting that this promise of victory is given to Joshua, and he carries out the plan. The 12 spies come back. Only 2 agree that can be done. The people take the side of the 12 or of the 10. Moses doesn't side with Joshua and Caleb. He kind of lets the majority rule, so to speak, and the people don't take the land. Moses doesn't say, no, wait, we can do this with God's help. Again, we do see a difference there between Joshua and Moses. And this, of course, is the Joshua who was one of those spies. As we conclude, then, this was yet another step in God's plan of redemption. It's a big event. God is fulfilling his promise to the people that he's going to give them a land. And with that promise of land, there is a testimony that can be had of God's victory in their lives. And that would be a call for people around them to follow after Yahweh as their Lord as well. What we see then taking place among the Israelites, they began to take the land in fulfillment of God's promise that was made originally to Abraham, and to Isaac, and then to Jacob. God is working out his plan of redemption, and it takes each of these steps along the way. This is just one step, but it's a big step. And it's a step in that larger plan of redemption. By way of personal application, I don't want to allegorize what Jericho is, but we do recognize that when we walk day by day, there are going to be certain battles that we face. And we know that God has given us a victory in the big thing. We have to trust him with each obstacle that gets in the way of that, because that's another battle for us to face. I think we see the big picture, of course, is God's plan of redemption being worked out, and that nothing is going to stop that plan. It's not going to be an enemy from the outside. It's not going to be internal strife from the inside. It won't be the people of Israel stopping this plan. What we've seen are the individuals among the covenant people who have to decide for themselves what they're going to do. And we can go back and look at those examples of previous lessons. We'll see more examples in succeeding lessons. What does this person do? How does this person respond? And what impact does it have then on God's larger plan of redemption? These big events, so to speak. This is a big event of big events. Maybe I've overstated, though I don't think I have, how big of an event taking of Jericho is. But it's important to recognize that God is working out his plan of redemption by developing and working through his people. What we need to be doing then, day by day, is thinking about what God's plan is for us and how we can then live in obedience to him. As we do live in obedience, we know that we will receive the victory. And as he's promised victory, he's also assured us that we still have to go through the battle. Paul, the apostle, can talk about that which is great gain for him, but he also talks about the prospect of the suffering that he endures for the sake of Christ. It's important to recognize that the battle means, or I should say it this way, the promise of victory means that there's going to be a battle. What we do is then we trust in God's presence among us so that we can see victory through his eyes and then carry it out in obedience to his commands, whatever those instructions might be. Let's have a word of prayer, and we'll talk about the next lesson. Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the word of promise that was given to Joshua about the taking of Jericho, which we knew would ultimately lead to their being able to take the rest of the land of Canaan, to fulfill your covenant promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that you would give them a land and ultimately a place